It's really my pleasure to be here to talk about energy efficiency. So this session is about energy efficiency, and I must confess I had a little trouble deciding what not to talk about. That's always my biggest problem. And I have a real passion for energy efficiency, and I've had the privilege of, for the last 5 or 6 years, traveling across the country, looking at these technologies, looking at leaders in this space, and documenting them in the Green Energy Futures series online. And so what I'm here to do today is to talk about energy efficiency. What I plan to do is some introductory stuff. Some stuff that will apply in your personal life and in your institutions and your facilities to kind of whet your appetite for energy efficiency. And then Mark's going to talk about programs. He actually delivers the MCCAC program, so he talks to institutions all the time, walks them through the process of taking on energy efficiency projects. In fact, he walked me through a process because I'm a volunteer in my own community league, and we're doing an energy efficiency upgrade, and we've done solar projects in my volunteer life as well. So Mark will be talking about the applied stuff, so don't get too worried if we're not getting to that quick enough. So, I'd just like to set the scene. I always like to do this. You can't talk about energy efficiency without talking about, this is all driven largely by climate change. You can't talk about efficiency without talking about energy and how we get our energy, and clean energy in particular. So this is the only slide I have about this in this presentation, but I feel compelled to share this with you. Nobody expected investment in clean technology to be as big as it is today, even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The investments have reached more than $300 billion a year in the world, and this slide kind of says a lot because this says where that investment's going. The yellow is solar, the blue is wind, and all the other colors are a bunch of other niche solutions like biogas and a whole bunch of other solutions. The ones that are economic and that are dominating the space worldwide are solar and wind. And that has some really interesting implications to energy efficiency and the future of our buildings, the future of how we're going to get around, where we live. It's going to have a lot of impact on us. So, what solar has done, because it's cheap now, it's so affordable, is it's enabled us to look at buildings in a very different way. You know, if you looked at solar back in the 1970s at the time of the oil crisis, as when Tanya was talking about it, it would have cost you more than the price of the house to power a house with solar. And that was not that long ago. In fact, Harold Orr, who was one of the grandfathers of the concept of the passive house in Saskatoon, was asked to build a solar-powered house by the Saskatchewan government at that time. He was at the Research Council. And in the end, he told them, I can't do it because this is not replicable. This is not going to help anybody if we build a house that costs a house to put the solar on the roof. And so instead, he pioneered the concept of the super energy efficient building. And in fact, this guy from Saskatchewan was just recognized in Germany last year for being one of the pioneers in the world of the passive house concept. Now the passive house, he learned right away that you couldn't achieve this with solar at that time because it was so expensive. And the passive house concept, what it does is it's ultra conservation oriented. So you build a house or a building that is 90% more energy efficient. That's 90%. You require 10% of the energy input of a standard building. And so that's how he got around that because he was literally forced to by economics in 1977 or whenever it was when he pioneered that. So fast forward to today, and now we're building net zero homes. This is a home in Calgary, Alberta, and it's 100% powered by solar. It's completely self-contained, and solar PV on the roof provides all the heat and all the electricity. There's no gas line to the house. Secondly, what we've learned, and this is really old, we should have learned this a really long time ago, is to build passive design into homes. And now we're getting so good at it that in a really strong passive designed building, you can get up to 50% of your heat. In a well-designed building, you can get about 30% of your heat just by the way you build the windows, by building some thermal mass into the building, by covering and shading the building windows in the summertime so it doesn't get 40 degrees in your building in the summertime. It's really not that complicated. I always like to say it's not rocket science, but it is science. And so the third thing that this home does is it heats its water using solar thermal modules, which is on the front, and they're kind of nice little architecturally designed thermal modules on the front. This is really exciting because the reason I'm showing you this and to talk about energy efficiency is this home is the ultimate expression of energy efficiency. So you can go out and you can buy yourself a better furnace and then a better water heater and add some insulation, or you can just buy this house, which has all of the best technology built right in. And the happy news is that this is affordable now. So this is a home, this is an actual show home right here in Edmonton that was opened about 6 months ago by Landmark Homes, who's been trying to pioneer this concept for a long time. This is a fully net zero home that sells for under $400,000, that does not have a gas hookup and will supply all of its own energy for the life of the home. So the only utility bill you'll get is an electricity bill, which allows you to exchange electricity from your solar system with the grid and to pull electricity back from the grid when the sun's not shining. So that amounts to about $50 a month. So this is going to come on strong because the economics are starting to look more and more attractive. In Vancouver, they've taken the passive house concept. So the passive house concept, once again, focuses mostly on efficiency, and they build apartment buildings. So this apartment building was built to the passive house standard. It was the first of its kind, 85-unit building in Vancouver, to the passive house standard. Why? Because the city of Vancouver is requiring builders of structures like this that require zoning changes to build to essentially a zero emission standard today. And that standard will be fully implemented by 2020. And so this is a fast-moving landscape, and that's my message, is that the innovation is happening, and following right behind that is policy innovation. And so this building was able to achieve those goals by building a passive house building instead of using other strategies. And it was so successful, though, and the economics were so good that the architect that built this building, Cornerstone Architecture out of Vancouver, has 16 more commissions to build buildings just like this before they finish the first one, because it's kind of found that magic place for a building. This building has no mechanical in it. So they omitted $600,000 worth of mechanical in this building, and each suite is heated by 300 watts resistance heating, which is the equivalent of 1/3 of a very small hairdryer. You know, you might have a hairdryer that's 1,500 watts or 1,800 watts. I'm saying 1,000 watts, and 1/3 of that heats each suite in this building. This is phenomenal, and this is going to impact all of us when we build buildings in a very positive way in the future. So you can't take this idea, by the way, and land it in Edmonton. You have to adjust it because we have a different energy puzzle here. 30 below is part of that puzzle instead of, you know, -5 or whatever it gets in Vancouver. So, and just to say about the energy efficiency thing, again, staying at the high level, is that people are embracing this idea of energy efficiency as a way of reducing emissions and saving energy. So in Europe, they've gone right straight to the end game. We sit around here in Canada and we debate, geez, how expensive is it to renovate a home to be super energy efficient? Or what the heck, take it all the way to net zero. Yes, it is expensive. It can be done. It'll become more economic as time goes on. But in the Netherlands, they've started this program called Energy Sprong, which translated means energy leap. And they have already established a national goal of renovating every single building in the country. And they have to net zero. So every building will have to be self-sufficient in its energy in the Netherlands, I think it's by 2050. And so they estimated in the beginning that these projects will cost about $100,000 a building. They're funding it 100% out of the energy costs, which again, it's a lot different structure in Europe because energy is a lot more expensive. They did the first 500 in a pilot project, first 500 projects. They have since let contracts for the next 10,000 buildings. What they've done is they've industrialized the process of doing energy retrofits to buildings to make it more cost effective. And they've married that to financing, and it's all built together. And because a part of the problem with this is if you go try to make your home net zero today by renovating it, you're gonna have to bring all these different trades together that really don't understand each other's technologies, and it's going to be quite a challenge, you know, unless you have some of those knowledge. So what they've done here is they brought that all together, but my point with the slide is this is the level of ambition that climate change is going to bring, and it's going to cause a lot of really positive things because what it's causing is amazing innovation. So these homes, the way they do this is so industrialized, they laser map the whole home and then they build the new components, and the renovation happens in 3 or 4 days. So the homeowners put out for about 3 or 4 days. They come back, they have a brand new net zero home basically with a new kitchen and a new bathroom. So that's retrofits. You know, we say that's the elephant in the room here because it is challenging. We have a lot of work to do before we can get to that stage. There is a guy in Calgary, and I feel obliged to share this story because I so much admire the guy. His name's Peter Darlington. He's a regular siding contractor in Vancouver who makes his living, you know, replacing siding on commercial buildings and regular homes. And he started a second company called Solar Homes Inc. And his goal is to start renovating homes to net zero. So he did his own home. He spent 2 years. He took courses in energy modeling, all kinds of things, and he's learning how to do this. So he did his own home. It was very successful. It was about a $95,000 project, and he did take his home all the way to net zero. So now he started a business doing that. It's very slow. He's only done a couple of projects so far, but that's okay because he's still doing the regular siding business. But this is what we need, is people to marry all of the different ideas. So if you're a siding contractor and you're going out and you're charging someone $20,000 to put new siding on their home right now, why wouldn't you add $10,000 worth of insulation while you're doing it and pay for the whole project? That's the kind of thinking we need to inspire. This is all happening, and I say that the innovation that's happening is happening through creative people for the most part, and it's not driven by policy, a lot of the innovation that's actually happening. But policy is following that innovation. In the case of Vancouver, they changed their regulation in Vancouver to allow you to build to the Passive House standard instead of building to LEED Gold plus 22% ASHRAE, which was their present standard at that time, and now it's an OR policy. But you're seeing this happen all over the place. So in Canada, the Pan-Canadian framework is calling for a net zero ready code by 2020. So that'll mean all new homes would be built to net zero ready standard by 2030. So that's pretty ambitious. I used to think it was more ambitious than I think it is now. I think climate change is driving this, but I think innovation is actually making it possible. I'm feeling every day like this is more possible than it ever was. In Vancouver, they have their zero emissions policy that's coming into play in 2020. BC's experimenting with a step code right now to move towards that net zero, so they're quite advanced in that way. In Edmonton here, we have the Blatchford community coming, so the idea of building a whole neighborhood that's carbon neutral, produces all of its own energy literally within the neighborhood. And we have a sustainable buildings policy and some other stuff that's happening here as well. So, going back to the leadership plan, the climate leadership plan, which you've already heard about from 2 speakers, Energy Efficiency Alberta comes out of this plan. That's where our budget came from. And what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about energy efficiency. So, before I do that, this is what the climate leadership plan looks like. So if you take the renewable energy investment, the energy efficiency investment, this is what it looks like. It looks like about 5,000 megawatts of new generation capacity, which will be mostly wind, I suspect, in this first wave, just because wind is one of the cheapest new forms of electricity you can produce of any kind today. Since we want clean energy, we're going to gravitate, because it's a competitive process, you're going to see a lot of wind unless we actually carve out the potential to have other technologies. That'll come with about 7,200 jobs and about $10.5 billion in investment. At Energy Efficiency Alberta, here's what drives me. Energy efficiency, as Tanya said, and I think as the minister said, is by far the best. If you're interested in reducing emissions, it's by far the best way to go. Here's why it makes sense. This is the McKinsey a cost abatement curve for greenhouse gas emissions that is, everybody uses this. I've seen it in so many slideshows. I don't fully understand it, to tell you the truth. It's kind of complicated. But I do know that when the lines go below, it means you're making money while saving energy and reducing emissions. And so without surprise, the first 4 or 5 or 6 things on the chart that go the furthest down and make you the most money while you're reducing emissions is energy efficiency. The renewable energy, just for perspective, comes somewhere in the middle. And on the far right, I don't have an arrow for it, but the little line at the far right that goes all the way up to the roof is a gas plant incorporating carbon capture and storage. So that's why carbon capture and storage is so challenging. It's very expensive. So I thought I would introduce you to the concept of energy efficiency a little bit by taking you home with me. And so I'm kind of geeky about this stuff. And so what I did a couple of years ago to learn about this stuff is I installed my own smart thermostat. Who had one of those Honeywell thermostats, the original programmable ones with the screen that was about ½ an inch square, and you needed a microscope to read it, and then you got so mad at it you uninstalled it because you couldn't figure out how to program it? That was me. I did that. In fact, I did uninstall it. And then along came the Nest thermostat, which was invented by Tony Furtado, who's the guy who invented the iPod and the precursor to the iPhone, and did it based on usability. And so he brought that to modern thermostats, and all of the ones that are successful are total mimics of the original Nest. So Ecobee is an awesome thermostat, and a lot of the other companies have thermostats like this. And what's really cool about them is they work. See, long ago, they stopped putting ratings on smart thermostats. What do they call the system in the US where they rate appliances and stuff? Energy Star. They used to have Energy Star ratings for thermostats, and they stopped doing that. Why? Why? I'm asking.
They all work? They're all equivalent?
Well, they're all, yes, that's partly true, but the real answer is they don't save you any energy. It's totally a behavior mechanism. So the problem with rating them is you're saying these things will save you energy, but if you don't use them or you don't program them, you don't save any energy. So they stopped putting ratings on them because it's a behavior mechanism. It's totally up to you to figure out how to use it. But now that they're easy to use, I've got to say, I used a 15-degree setback during the day after the kids go to school and again at night, and I have saved close to 30% on my heating bills with one simple little device. So I feel obliged to share that with you because, you know, if you want to do one simple thing that doesn't change your life in any shape or form and will save you 30% of your heating expense, which is most of your energy that you use in your home, goes to heating water and the air in your home. So the other thing, Energy Efficiency Alberta doesn't have a program for furnaces. And, you know, we heard a lot from people that said, why don't you? And the data showed us it wasn't the highest priority item when we were designing our programs because for a simple reason, you will make the right decision without our help. And in fact, I guess I'm an example of that because my furnace quit when I was on a working trip in Prince Edward Island a couple years ago. My daughter calls me up and says, Dad, the house is getting awfully cold. And so, you know, me being the geek that I am, I really wanted to do a lot of research and figure out what the newest, coolest way of heating my home was. No, couldn't do that. I had to buy a furnace literally on the internet within hours and order it because my house was getting cold. So, but you know what? Even with no time to make the decision, I bought a 97% efficient furnace. It was very economical, and I improved my heating efficiency in my home by another 20%. Because in my 20-year-old home, the EnerGuide sticker on the old furnace was between the wall and the furnace where there was 1 inch of space, and I didn't see it until they literally uninstalled my furnace, and it said 77%. So if you're keeping track, my thermostat, just a simple thermostat, and just replacing my furnace has reduced my heating costs in my home by 50%. So, you know, you can make this really complicated, or you can make it common sense. And that's my message about a lot of energy efficiency measures. So there is one more thing I feel obliged to talk about. There's another appliance that I'd like to talk about that is also not, we don't have a rebate for this, and it's probably because it's still pretty early days for these, because there were 2 appliances that have not improved at all in terms of efficiency over the years, and the stove is one of them, and the dryer, and they share this one common thing in that they produce heat through the same mechanism. They take electricity and they turn it into heat, and nobody's figured out how to defy the laws of physics and make that more efficient. It just, the way it works, this is the way it works. And then some folks, though, invented the induction stove. And so the induction stove, not hugely popular yet in Canada, but it will be because it's 50% more efficient. So again, when I was looking at stoves, I just about pestered the Sears guy to the end of the planet, looking in drawers and saying, don't you have something more energy efficient? At that time, about 4 years ago, there weren't a lot of options. And so finally, he was getting impatient with me, and he said, well, have you heard of induction? And so he took me over and he showed me these 2 stoves that were off in the corner by the dishwashers, and that's the stove right there that he showed me in my own kitchen. That is, the reason I'm telling you this story is, you know, remember the old days when Jimmy Carter was talking about energy efficiency and he talked about putting a sweater on and turning the lights off? Remember that? So my idea of energy efficiency is that it should perform better. Whatever we do, it should be better than the past. We don't have to go live in a cave to be energy efficient. We should actually challenge ourselves more than that, to actually produce solutions that are better and save us energy. So this device saves me half on the electricity costs of my stove, but that's not the end of the story. It's my favorite appliance in my whole house. This thing is so much better than any other stove I've ever used in my life, it's not even funny. You can boil water on here faster than you can do it in a microwave. It doesn't get hot, so you don't burn food on the top. You boil your water, you can put your hand on the burner. It's totally, absolutely even heat. It's a chef's delight. And so that's why I like it. I like solutions that are actually better and actually solve, provide you with convenience as well as solving an energy efficiency problem. So, just as by way of introduction to energy efficiency, all of the devices in our home, sans the two that I talked about before, have become a lot more efficient due to a variety of reasons over the years. And this is a graph starting from the 1970s that shows you most of the major appliances in the home. And the fridge in particular, that old Harvest Gold fridge you might still have in your garage as a beer fridge, hopefully you don't because it's an energy nightmare, used 3.5 times more energy than the fridge you will buy today. And the fridge you'll buy today is better. It probably has an ice maker, and it uses less than a third of the energy. So appliances have improved a lot over the years, and it's worth knowing that. So this compares a suite of appliances in your home over a 20-year period from 1990 to 2010. So the energy consumption on the right is the total consumption of all your appliances just looking 20 years down the road. There is one device, as I said before, a couple that haven't improved. This is the clothes dryer, uses resistance heat, which again, they haven't figured out a more efficient way to do this. And so I haven't found too much to replace this. There are some ideas. There's condensing dryers in Europe that are very small, and they take about 3 times longer to dry. They work fine, nothing wrong with them. They would just come as a bit of a cultural shock to us. Anybody who's been to Europe and stayed in a B&B and used one of them will know this. And there's another technology coming on that is very promising. That's called heat pumps. So Whirlpool has an amazing large-scale heat pump dryer right now, which I think will be the future of dryers. But unfortunately, the model they have out has a couple of design flaws in it. It has nothing to do with the heat pump. It just has to do with the dryer. And so I think when they get that right, it's going to change. But for now, the only solution I've found that's better is not one I subscribe to a lot, but it's the clothesline. Again, we've heard about this, and by the way, there's an anecdote here. When we started our rebate program, I didn't notice this at first, but we actually had clotheslines in our program, and I thought it was kind of funny. I thought it was there for educational purposes. Funny thing is, we sold a whole bunch of clotheslines through the rebate program, so some people are actually taking it seriously, and that's great to see. We heard about this, I think it was in Tanya's presentation, the cost of your building and really 50% of the cost being the operating costs. Well, when you look at certain devices and appliances, in this case a hot water heater, that's even worse. You go to Canadian Tire, you've saved $100 with your coupon on your new water heater, you get somebody to install it, and you feel great. The problem is, that's not the $100 you should be worrying about. You should be worrying about what you have to feed that dryer to make it work over the next 10 years. In this case, this graph is made based on a 10-year life. Of course, most of us try to extend it well beyond that. So 88% of the cost of a water heater is the energy you put into it. So that's how you have to think when you're thinking about buildings, energy efficiency, cars. It almost doesn't matter which of these situations we're talking about. So what did I do in my own house? Yep, I had a 20-year-old water heater, which was about 60% efficient. So I went through the process of researching this recently. I looked at heat pump water heaters, which is definitely one of the up-and-coming technologies. These things are about 250% efficient. And they run on electricity, so that's why you see them in net zero buildings that don't have gas hookups. In the end, what I went for was a tankless water heater. And it was interesting because I looked at the most efficient conventional water heaters, the new power-vented versions of them. They were more expensive than this. And I looked at the heat pump. They were a little more expensive, not as expensive as the power-vented ones. And this unit was the cheapest of the ones I looked at when I compared high-efficiency devices. And so this one is the one I actually installed, and it's 97% efficient. So again, I've gained, boy, that's a lot of math, 37% efficiency on heating. And again, water heating is about 20% of your demand for heating. And in buildings, in commercial buildings and businesses, it's even more so. So heating and water heating are even more dominant in terms of energy use. I just wanted to tell you one story about energy efficiency. We have great programs, and you should take advantage of our programs, whether you're at home or your institution, and we can help you do that. But I wanted to tell, back to this scenario of common sense, I wanted to tell the story of a guy I met from St. Albert, Alberta. His name is Ron Kube. And he went out, he saw a solar system on his neighbor's house, read about it in the paper, went and asked him about it, got all excited. This guy's a university professor, thought solar was super sexy, super cool. So he gets all excited, he goes back home, and what the solar guy said was, add up your utility bills. So he did, he added up his utility bills. He has a remarkably average home, very, very average, probably the typical average Alberta home. You can see it right there in terms of square footage. And yet he found out he was using about 60% more electricity than the average home in Alberta, and he couldn't explain why. He didn't have a hot tub, didn't have anything crazy in his house. And so this sent him on a journey to learn about energy efficiency before he installed a solar system. So Ron went crazy. The guy's a professor of robotics, and he felt compelled to use data, so he installed an e-gauge system in his home to measure every single one of the circuits on his panel. He installed little measuring devices on all of his appliances and kept data for 2 or 3 days and put this all in a big spreadsheet, and he figured out exactly where he was using his energy. So what happened was he found out that lighting was in fact his biggest use of electricity in his home. Why? Because he had not converted, he missed the message about LED lights or even compact fluorescents. They were all still incandescents. This is a smart guy, he's a professor, he just never thought about it, right? So he goes through his house, replaces 80 light bulbs. The worst offender he found in his house is this guy. He had 800 watts in his dining room, 800 watts of lighting in his dining room, which is now about 70 or something like that. His total lighting, like all the lights in the home, if you turned them on, would have added up to about 6,000 watts, which is unbelievable. So the second thing he found, and this is why I love telling this story, is this is like the cliche of energy efficiency, because he had one of those old fridges in his garage, and all it had was a few bottles of beer and a bottle of wine in it. And he found out this was his second biggest consumer in the house, and so solution, unplug it. Very simple. The third thing he found was, you guys know what phantom power is, or power vampires? You guys heard that term? So all those little things, your chargers, your VCRs, your TVs, your computers, your hard drives, all that stuff that's all plugged in and using energy even when you're not using them. Printers are notorious. You might use your printer 2 or 3 times a week, and yet it's sitting there consuming 20, 25 watts of power 24/7. So he had the most modest entertainment system I've ever seen. He's got to see the one that my kids have. I have a much bigger prize than this, but he was able to cut that in half, and he found it was 7% of his energy use, his electricity use in his home, were all those power vampires. So he just bought some power bars and cut that back, and lo and behold, when he was done, I'm pressing the button, he reduced his lighting from 340 kilowatt hours, I think the units were per month, or was that per annum, I can't remember, to 75. So you can see really dramatic. He reduced his fridge and freezer. So his beer fridge was using more energy than his modern fridge and freezer combined. And by unplugging that, he shrunk that part of the pie as well. And he shrunk his entertainment system from 65 to 24. So that was pretty significant. And no change in lifestyle whatsoever. So this is his new, I just put the graph over it so you could see the original graph. So see the lighting there? That's the blue. So now where is he? Well, I'm going to abbreviate the story, but he still got to install a solar system. After he reduced his electricity use, but he did it in 2015. So he'd only done some of his energy efficiency measures, and so you're allowed to put a solar system as large as your energy demand on your home. So he did. He put I think it was about a 10, I'm spacing on the size of the system. I think it was 8 kilowatts or something like that. I can't remember. But it was matched to his energy use. So, and then he kept doing energy efficiency. So now he's got 20,000 kilowatt hours a year of extra production of solar electricity, which, yes, you can sell it back to the grid, and you get that marginal price. If you're paying 5 cents a kilowatt hour, that's what you get paid for your solar electricity. So it's not a huge value. You wouldn't install more solar to sell electricity at 5 cents. It wouldn't make sense. But in his case, he had already done the energy conservation. And so guess what happened? Is he started doing some more math. The guy's a professor, remember, so he couldn't help himself. And he figured out the value proposition of that electricity. So if he sells it back to the grid, he gets 5 cents or 6 cents or whatever he's paying for electricity. But if he bought an electric car, he found out his surplus electricity was enough to move a Nissan Leaf 20,000 kilometers a year, or in other words, the whole average mileage of the average car that's driven by the average person in a year. So just with his spare solar electricity, he can power a car, in other words, replacing all of the gas, all of the stuff you feed into your car, and run it for a year just with his surplus solar electricity. So I've never heard of anybody doing this calculation. He did the calculation as to what that is worth to him. So instead of selling the extra electricity, if he actually was able to use it and power it to use his car, which is a bit of a logistical challenge there, because you'd have to charge it when the solar system's on. But if he did that, the value to him is 88 cents a kilowatt hour. That's 88 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's the value of offsetting all the gas and powering your car with electricity. So, wow. If you know the price of energy storage, for example, I always say we don't need energy storage here yet. We're not anywhere near that stage in Alberta yet. And you know, the rule of thumb is energy storage is worth about 25 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's pretty expensive if you're buying your electricity at 5 cents. But if you're offsetting a device where the value proposition is 88 cents, suddenly this is a whole different idea. So he could literally buy a battery system, store his solar power, and still save more than double on the cost of fueling his vehicle. So I thought that was kind of a cool story. I wanted to tell you one example before I turn it over to Mark here about a real-life example of energy efficiency. You know, when we have institutions and we're trying to save energy, we often have people that live in the buildings. And I have a social housing example from Vancouver. So, and this could be any kind of housing, but in Vancouver, they've done some research on this, the social housing agencies, and they found out that social housing in BC, on average, uses 50% more energy per unit area than the average rental property. So either they were made more, well, it's a combination of things. They may have been made more poorly, and they have some inefficiencies built in. And I'll talk about that in a second. So if residents don't pay their utilities, they also found that residents will use 133% more energy in the home. So they'll leave the windows open when the heating's on, whatever, a whole variety of things. You just don't care, so you waste energy. So in these buildings, what an energy advisor that the social housing agencies hired, which by the way was a great thing to do, they hired their own energy advisor to help all of the different social housing agencies access funding, determine whether it was a smart thing to do these projects. It was just a really smart thing to do. So their energy advisor goes around and identifies whether different agencies can qualify for grants, and even helps them with the analysis of whether they should spend their own money doing energy efficiency projects. It's been very, very successful. And so in these buildings, a lot of them have a lot of low-hanging fruit. So what he winds up doing is a lot of boilers and a lot of some lighting and some hot water systems as well in these buildings. And so they've been able to save, 10 to 30% with a very simple upgrade, which is some of the things that we're seeing in Alberta right now today. But the whole behavior thing is even trickier. So the reason I bring that up is because we have residents in our buildings. It's not easy to manage those residents. So you want to be cognizant of that. You want to be cognizant of what you're doing has a behavior component to it. And if it does, do you need to manage that component? It's very important to think about that. And I think that's it. So from my perspective, the reason I get jazzed about energy efficiency, there's a lot we could have covered here, but hopefully Mark will touch on the tangible stuff for you. But the reason I'm excited about energy efficiency is our program here in Alberta is modeled after one in Nova Scotia and one in Oregon and Vermont, which are some of the most successful programs in North America. And if I can show you this graphic a few years from now, this is the annual report from Nova Scotia that tells you how successful energy efficiency has been. The minister said at some point we should talk about energy efficiency as an energy resource, as an input to the system, a negative input into the system, which is actually worth something. In Nova Scotia, energy efficiency actually bids into the grid every year. So they get their funding just by bidding into the grid at a price. And they'll say, we'll provide you with X kilowatt hours at 3 cents a kilowatt hour in terms of megawatts. And that's how they get funded in Nova Scotia. So in Nova Scotia, they've managed with a very similar structure that we have here in Alberta to save their residents and businesses about $110 million a year. They have made about their businesses. Last year, they engaged with 487 businesses. That means there's 487 businesses that are just a little bit more competitive and have lower operating costs. They take credit in Nova Scotia, and it's a much smaller program in Nova Scotia, for 1,000 jobs, just as a result of energy efficiency. And to the minister's point about looking at energy efficiency as a resource, this is 8 years into their program in Nova Scotia. They have saved 1% of all provincial electricity demand per year for 8 years. So they've reduced electricity demand in Nova Scotia by 8% and consistently at about 1% a year, which is huge. That's a number of power plants worth of electricity.